So I was getting ready to take a mid-afternoon nap on a thin foam pad laid down on a hard linoleum floor in a classroom in an old historic schoolhouse somewhere in Kansas City. I was there with my partner at the time. We were participating in a gathering of Catholic workers from across the Midwest. And we had been flown out to Kansas City to give a presentation on our involvement in humanitarian and immigrant justice work here on the border, our work with No More Deaths, and which I understand this congregation recently did a fundraiser for, so thank you for that. So back to the nap, this gathering was taking place over a weekend in this old historic schoolhouse, and there were a couple of rooms that were designated and set aside for quiet rooms during the day. So we went in to rest. And when we came in, we noticed there was already a gentleman also laid down on the hard floor in between rows of desks. And I said something out of politeness just to say, sorry for the noise, I hope we don't disturb you. And he replied with something like, oh yeah, don't worry about it. I'm used to sleeping in uncomfortable, noisy places. I've been in prison. I just got out of prison for the past several years. And if you've heard of the Catholic worker movement, which I was fairly new to at the time, you'd know that this is a group of people who act out of their deep faith convictions and are often arrested at protests for political actions. And many Catholic workers, war and poverty are the main issues that they organize against. The man's voice seemed old and a little raspy, but still cheery. And I could see him, it was dark, I could see him lying on the floor. And I thought to myself, this guy is way too old to be lying on this hard floor. And I was also intrigued, though, about this prison comment. So I said, oh, what were you in for? And I knew there would be a good story behind this. The nap idea quickly faded away. This guy, who I found out was a priest, Reverend Father Carl Cabot, and started talking. And it turns out that he and some friends had went to an equipment rental yard in their Volkswagen van. They got an air compressor and the biggest jackhammer that they could lift, and they headed out into the fields of Missouri where they knew of a Minuteman II nuclear missile silo. They parked the VW bus, they set up the equipment, and they started jackhammering away at the massive concrete lid on top of this underground missile silo. Take a moment and let that sink in. That was in 1984, and 4 years before that, in 1980, Carl Cabot and some of his friends, including Daniel Berrigan and his brother Philip Berrigan, all broke into a General Electric weapons plant with hammers and started banging on the nose cones of the Mark 12A nuclear warheads, hoping to damage and disable several of those. And over the following years, as I learned these stories, and in between prison sentences, he continued to participate in similar actions, usually dressed in a clown suit, complete with a red nose. After I learned about Carl's story, I looked into the whole history of what is known as the Plowshares movement, and the name comes from a often quoted and famous biblical passage from the book of Isaiah that says, "And he shall judge among the nations and rebuke many people, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore." And this idea of repurposing weapons into useful farm tools is a potent visual, as well as an important divine command. Carl Cabot explained it in a newspaper interview by saying this: "To beat a sword into a plowshare, you need a hammer. Well, a jackhammer is just a little bigger hammer." And what he didn't say is that a nuclear missile is a way bigger sword. For all of this and more, Cabot told us that he'd been in prison for a total of 17 years. and he was now in his 70s, and I met him about 12 years ago. And I was just reading up on him, and I found out that he was arrested again 2 years ago at the age of 80 for splashing red paint over the sign of a newly completed national security campus, another federal nuclear weapons facility. And the red paint was symbolizing blood. He was sentenced to serve 1 day. He was processed and released, and he told the judge says, "What do you want?" And he said, "I want all nuclear weapons to be gone." And the judge said, "Well, I don't want to put you in jail." And Carl Cabot said, "Well, then find a way to non-violently shoot me." I lift up Carl's story here not just because it's unique, but because I really want to see what those opening words from Daniel Berrigan might mean for us. In that opening reading, Berrigan says that as a nation we are fully committed to war, and even knowing the deadly cost of war, we've got an entire national mindset and industry that continually, eagerly, and in his words, wholeheartedly lead us and drive us into war. And we, broadly speaking, as a nation, only have a desire for peace. He says that society is not willing to pay the cost for peace. And we are obviously, because we have been doing it, willing to pay the cost of war. And I would personally tease out a little bit of what we mean by the use of the word willing, because I believe it's a little more of a coercion placed upon the greater population than a real willingness of all Americans to engage in war after war. But what is this cost of peace that Berrigan says that we're not willing to pay? He says it is giving up privilege and power and taking seriously the issues of social justice here in our own communities. Carl Cabot and the other Plowshares activists demonstrated their willingness to give up a lot of their personal privilege and freedom with their choices to target and attack weapons facilities and weapons themselves. He wanted to see the weapons destroyed, and he wanted to see the facilities shut down. It's commendable in my mind. How does it sound to you hearing this? Is it heroic? Is it foolish? Should he and others be celebrated publicly or relegated to an inconsequential blip in history? I'd like to offer this little scenario or thought experiment. In many towns that I've driven through and cities, I've seen these banners hung up, usually on light poles downtown, with the photos of military personnel from that town. We had those in the town I grew up in Prescott and Prescott Valley. And what if instead, or also, we put up banners with large photos of the peace activists that came out of our towns and cities, or the activists for any other justice cause? What would a town council meeting look like where that proposal was made? Who would be against it and why? Who would argue for it? I can imagine that in my own hometown of Prescott Valley, where many of my classmates and many of my friends from Boy Scouts joined the military, if I were to go to this town council and offer a resolution to hang up banners honoring the activists that also came out of my high school class, I would be laughed at, or maybe even threatened. I actually feel like a little sense of fear even thinking about doing something like that. Can you imagine here in the city of Chandler, Mesa, or Phoenix, that kind of a resolution put forth? And of course, here at Valley UU, you know a bit about hanging up a banner with a radically different message than is typically shown in the neighborhood and the community, and I thank you for that. I know that for me, I envision backlash. I can hear the same language and words that I heard during the lead up to the invasion of Iraq, that we must support the troops, and if you're anti-war, you're unpatriotic. I want to see us to be able to celebrate publicly those who agitate for peace and justice with the same, equal, or more bravado as the way that war is often publicly celebrated. Can you imagine on the big screen, the Jumbotron at a major league sports event, the photo being put up of a guy jackhammering on a nuclear missile silo, and the entire stadium cheering, applauding for that. What would it take to make that possible? Why can't the peace movement get that kind of recognition and public support? And I believe that's a bit of what Daniel Berrigan was getting at when he used the word cowardice to describe the peace movement. Cowardice, it's a harsh indictment. Berrigan said that we only want peace with half a heart, and he is speaking directly to the people of the peace movement when he said that. He says we are unwilling to pay the full price for peace. Cowardice is a harsh indictment indeed. So here is where I would like to add a new voice and a different perspective and bring in the wisdom of Thich Nhat Hanh, a Vietnamese Buddhist monk who spent a lifetime teaching and writing about peace. He lived through and thankfully survived the devastating war that America waged against the country of Vietnam. And he was exiled, he has been exiled from his home country due to his peace efforts there. He has much insight to share for us. Thich Nhat Hanh writes this wonderful passage. We often think about peace as the absence of war, that if the powerful countries would just reduce their weapons arsenals, we could have peace. But if we look deeply into the weapons, we see our own minds, our prejudices, our fears, and ignorance. Even if we transport all the bombs to the moon, the roots of war and the roots of the bombs will still be here in our hearts and in our minds. And sooner or later, we will make more bombs. To work for peace is to uproot war from ourselves and from the hearts of men and women. It is this sentence I like the most. Even if we transport all the bombs to the moon, the roots of war and the roots of the bombs are still here in our hearts and in our minds. And sooner or later, we will make new bombs. So the weapons aren't necessarily the problem. They are a symptom of the problem. It's the overall mindset that will lead a society to build and rebuild the same weapons. And so Thich Nhat Hanh provides this observation of this symptom, that when we are full of prejudices and fears and ignorance, we will build weapons and prepare for violence. And then he offers this diagnosis that our hearts and minds are full of prejudices and fear and ignorance. And his answer or his prescription is to uproot war from our hearts. And if you're familiar with Thich Nhat Hanh and other Buddhist teachers and meditation teachers, you know that the how to do that is grounded usually in some form of practice of mindfulness, a practice that will bring inner peace to ourselves. So in my own limited training and meditation, I was taught that there is not necessarily a goal of attaining inner peace. You shouldn't even have goals. But through the consistent practice of meditation and mindfulness, we see that inner peace and contentment and compassion has the space to naturally arise on its own. When I started a consistent practice of meditation, I wanted to have a calm, peaceful mind. And maybe this might resonate with some of you who have gone down this path also. When my mind wasn't calming down and the thoughts kept coming in and taking over, I felt frustrated and that I was doing it wrong. It was a battle in my own head, and it still is sometimes. And I use that word, battle, because it is a reflection of the idea of war. I have an ideal of what I want my state of mind to be or what it ought to be, and I'm going to fight against myself to achieve it. I'll even start acquiring various means to assist in that fight. I'll try breathing with counting, or breathing in a certain way and breathing out a certain way, or breathing with a mantra, or labeling my breaths. One of these needs to be an effective weapon for mindfulness. And if that fails, I'll escalate to a full-blown arsenal of a 5-day silent retreat, complete with bells and incense, prostrations at 5 a.m., yoga, and mindful chewing of each vegetarian meal. And then I realized that after this strife and struggle, and my mind still isn't calm and settled and peaceful, that I've been engaged in my own war, silently sitting on a cushion in the middle of a floor. I'm both the soldier and the collateral damage. I'm both the jackhammer and the missile silo. I think of these mindfulness techniques that I've used against myself as weapons, and I compare it to the plowshares mentality, the plowshares movement. How do I transform and reforge those weapons into useful tools? And I come to laughter, and I can laugh at how silly I was to think that I could force myself to be more peaceful. I think of Carl Cabot with his jackhammer and clown suit. He knows how silly and foolish it is to have massive stockpiles of nuclear weapons capable of blowing up our planet many times over, how foolish it is to invest so much into that rather than beneficial services for our society. And he knows how foolish it is to be jackhammering away at a nuclear missile silo to begin with. And so laughter and joy and some silliness, surely that has to be a better path towards inner peace and subduing that sense of war within. So when I think back to the day that I met Carl Cabot, I can't help but smile. I never sensed any bitterness or resentment from his time in prison. Carl was actually a super fun and joyful guy and a friendly guy to be around, and just getting to know him and hear his story that was punctuated with his own laughter, lifted the spirits in my own heart. I see him definitely as someone who has pulled the roots of war out of his heart. I felt the presence of deep compassion for the world, and he had an aura of priestly wisdom and a serious commitment to outrageous goofiness. I appreciate the Carl Cabots of the world. I've never met Thich Nhat Hanh, but I also find a joy and happiness in his teachings through his books and recordings that I've listened to. And I imagine that he'd be a great person to hang out with as well. Someone who's very present and who's also very happy, and someone who has committed an entire life to spreading compassion and happiness to others. Definitely someone who has pulled the roots of war out of his own heart. And no resentment or anger for the experiences and the things that he's been through in his life. I deeply appreciate the Thich Nhat Hanhs of this world. Carl Cabot is now 82, Thich Nhat Hanh is 89. Daniel Berrigan was 94 when he passed away 4 weeks ago. And I'm in my mid-30s, and I'd like to think that I've got another 50 years ahead of me in my life. And I'd really like to think that I'll have the courage and the tenacity to continue being a peacemaker in this world, or an activist, or this new term I just learned, a social justice warrior. This is interesting. There was actually a pejorative term used by some anti-feminist men's groups who have been targeted by gender justice activists, and I think it's a great term. May we all strive to be social justice warriors. And as Unitarian Universalists, when we look back and look out across our own history of activism and peacemaking, does our faith and our teaching give us the resources and the fortitude to be wholeheartedly in this movement? In what ways are we a people of jackhammers, directly confronting the war machine as an outward expression of our faith and action? And in what ways are we a people of mindfulness, turning inwards to bring inner peace to our own lives, our families, and our communities? Whichever it is or whatever it is, I want us to see that challenge of raising the price that we are willing to pay for peace, of knowing the ways that we are going to be bolder or willing to maybe give up certain privileges and comforts or be more creative and outspoken and even silly. As UUs, I know we are on this path. And when I see us embracing and partnering with groups like Black Lives Matter to make bold demands for racial justice, when we partner with groups like Rising Tide to make bold demands for climate justice, and when we partner with groups like Puente to make bold demands for immigration justice, that's the great value of being in a UU community, because we are continually challenging ourselves to show up in these new ways and to keep increasing our commitments to peace and justice. So today, on Memorial Day weekend, we can both celebrate that external activism and justice work that we know we've done and the jackhammers that we've wielded. And we can explore the ways that we can continue tearing the roots of war internally out of our own hearts. We're not alone. We've got work to do. And may we find our jackhammers and practices of mindfulness to guide us on our way. Amen and blessed be.